vážené dámy, vážení páni a milí priatelia ekonomického myslenia, slobody a zdravých peňazí. Moje meno je Gonda a za Konzervatívny inštitút Milana Rastislava Štefánika vás vítam na ďalšej, a to už 56. prednáške v rámci nášho programu Konzervatívny Economic Voltage Lecture Series, oceneného v roku 2009 Templeton Freedom Award v kategórii Etika a hodnoty. Ani dnešnú prednášku by sme nemohli uskutočniť bez podpory a spolupráce našich partnerov. Naša vďaka preto patrí nadácii databanky, IT firme Trinit, softwarovej spoločnosti Gratex International, dvom spoločnostiam obchodujúcimi s cennými papiermi CEQLS Private Investments a European Investment Center, advokátskej kancelárii MST Partners, nadačnému fondu Baumit pri Centre pre filantropiu, Slovenskej asociácii finančníkov, Slovak Students for Liberty, týždenníkom Týždeň a Trend, internetovému spravodajskému portálu Aktuálne.sk, slovenskej tlačovej agentúre SITA, internetovému denníku Energie portál a hotelu Park Inn by Radisson Danube Bratislava. Dnes môžeme medzi nami privítať ďalšieho vzácneho hostia, ktorým je ekonóm so širokým výskumným zameraním na makroekonómiu, dejiny ekonomickej histórie, metodológiu ekonómie a rakúsku ekonómiu Karla-Friedricha Israela, ktorý sa vo svojom učení a vo svojich prácach opiera o takých mysliteľov, ekonómov, akými boli Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek a Marie Rothbard. Špecializuje sa pritom práve na menovú politiku a jej dôsledky na nerovnosť, čo je téma dnešnej prednášky, ale zároveň je to veľmi dôležitá téma v súčasnosti. A to nie len kvôli tomu, že sa postupne prejavujú dôsledky politík centrálnych plánovacích peňažných úradov, nazývaných centrálne banky, ale aj kvôli tomu, že nerovnosti, príjmové a majetkové nerovnosti sú častými vhodnými zámienkami pre posilňovanie kolektivizmu a pre oslabovanie a podkopávanie inštitúcií kapitalizmu a slobodnej spoločnosti, na ktorých stoja dnešné spoločnosti, vďaka ktorým prosperujeme. Predtým, ako mu odovzdám slovo, chcem povedať ešte niekoľko vied, ktoré potvrdzujú jeho erudovanosť. Karl-Friedrich Israel je docentom, respektíve mimoriadnym profesorom na katedre ekonómie a manažmentu podnikania Université Catholique de l'Est Angers a prednáša aj na univerzite v Lipsko, kde bol kolegom Günthera Schnabla, ktorý mi odporučil nášho dnešného hostia a ktorý tiež prednášal v rámci programu CEQLS. Doktorát z ekonómie získal za dizertačnú prácu práve o nákladoch a prínosoch centrálnych bank, pričom vedúcim jeho práce bol profesor Guido de Huysmans, ktorý tiež prednášal aj v rámci programu CEQLS. Docentu získal za výskum konceptu neutrality peňazí a nepriaznivých účinkov menovej politiky. Karl-Friedrich Israel získal aj mnoho ocenení, napríklad cenu Garyho Schlaurama za excelentnosť vo výskume a výučbe mladého vedca, ktorú mu udelil Mises Institute v USA, a cenu American Institute for Economic Research za druhé miesto v súťaži na tému zdravé peniaze. A my máme dnes vzácnu možnosť si vypočuť jeho prednášku a diskutovať s ním práve na túto aktuálnu tému dôsledkov menovej politiky a nie primárne na infláciu, ale na príjmové a majetkové nerovnosti. Takže pevne verím, že si oceníme a užijeme si intelektuálny zážitok z prednášky a z diskusie. Na to je dôležité, aby sme mali stíšené a vypnuté svoje mobilné telefóny, aby sme sa vzájomne nerušili. A teraz už naozaj odovzdám slovo pánovi profesorovi Izraelovi, aby odprezentoval jeho prednášku. Dear Mr. Israel, floor is yours.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Mr. Gonda, thank you very much for the kind invitation and introduction. At least I trust it was a kind introduction because my Slovak is like my Chinese, non-existent. So I trust it was, you had some kind words to say about me. I heard my own name, I heard the name of Mises and Hayek and Rothbard, but that is the extent of what I understood from the introduction. I'm afraid I will be continuing in English, and the topic of my talk tonight are the consequences of monetary policy on income and wealth inequality. This is a very important topic in my own opinion. It is very relevant for public policy debates today, and it has been a primary occupation of myself in my own research over the past couple of years. I want to start this talk by showing you some interesting data points. This is a statistic that I published fairly recently in an English article that was also translated into Slovak. I think it is the first time that a text of mine was translated into Slovak. What you can see here is some data on the evolution of the income distribution in the United States of America. You have two segments of the income distribution. You have the top 1% of the American population in terms of income earnings over time, and you have the bottom 50%. And what you can see is that in the beginning of the period, in the 60s, there was a trend towards more equality. The income share of the bottom 50% was increasing, the income share of the top 1% was decreasing, and then there was a trend reversal quite suddenly in the early 1970s. And since then, income inequality has increased, the top 1% income share has grown, the bottom 50% income share has decreased, which tells us that income inequality has overall increased in the United States. This is a very striking empirical finding. You might have seen this before. It's very popular. It's often shown also when pundits from the political left talk about these issues and want to argue that, well, the capitalist system is bad. Look at the United States, how income inequality is rising. We should do something about it. And I agree we should do something about it, but we have to understand what the causes are. And in my talk, I want to suggest that one of the drivers is monetary policy. It's not the only driver. We rarely have monocausal phenomena in the social science and in economics in particular. But monetary policy is one cause of this development, and I want to persuade you that this is the case in the next hour or so. So this is the structure of my little presentation. I want to first of all talk about monetary policy in theory and practice. I want to describe what is going on and what has been done over the past couple of decades. Before I enter into the arguments for why monetary policy actually contributes to inequality and also undermines social mobility in society. And then in the end I want to talk about some further implications of these developments for the broader political and cultural landscape. For those of you who are inclined to read more about this, there are 3 references listed here of publications of mine over the past couple of years. The first one is a joint publication with Gunter Schnabel, who has been here, I think 2 years ago, given a lecture, and who talked about some elements that I will also repeat in my talk. So some elements might sound familiar to those of you who have listened to Professor Schnabel back in 2022. The other two papers are a bit more technical. Those are empirical statistical analysis of the development of income inequality and wealth inequality in Japan and how it is related to Japanese monetary policy. Japan is a very interesting case because the Japanese were the first to invent what we today call unconventional monetary policy. So Japan is a very interesting country to study the effects of unconventional monetary policy because it has done or implemented these policies for the longest time among developed economies. But in my talk I want to primarily focus on Europe and a little bit on the US. So let us jump in. Monetary policy in theory and practice. When we talk about monetary policy, we always have to talk about central banks because central banks are the institutions that are in charge of monetary policy. And central banks can be defined technically as legal monopolists in the production of base money. Base money we sometimes call M0. It's a monetary aggregate that contains all of the cash money in circulation that you hold in your pockets and all of the bank reserves. So that's cash sitting at the banks to back demand deposits and also money that the commercial banks have on their bank accounts with the central bank. Yeah, so that's M0 and that is completely controlled by central banks. Central bank monetary policy in essence is about changing the base money stock, changing M0. But M0 is not really the primary target. What is really interesting for monetary policy and the effects of monetary policy is a larger monetary aggregate which we call M1. M1 contains cash in circulation, again, that's the same element that we have in the base money stock, plus demand deposits, and that's basically money on regular bank accounts that private individuals, businesses, households, etc. hold with their commercial banks. And these demand deposits are only partially backed by bank reserves, since we have a fractional reserve banking system. So commercial banks have some room for influencing the money stock M1, and central banks only indirectly control this. They have different tools in their monetary policy toolkit. They can change the legal reserve requirements, of course. They can change interest rates. They can engage in open market operations. They can engage in unconventional asset purchase programs. All of these influence M1. They directly influence M0. They indirectly influence M1. And the primary goal of monetary policy, that's very important, that holds everywhere, not to the same extent, but more or less, the policy goal is a 2% year-on-year inflation rate. This is the primary goal certainly in the Eurozone. This is specified in the books of the ECB. In the US it's slightly different. It's one among other policy goals such as employment and economic growth. It's on equal footing in the US, but everywhere price inflation matters. And in Europe it's the core, the primary goal of monetary policy. So now we have the tools of monetary policy and we have the goal of monetary policy. Now we can think about this a little bit, and the obvious question that arises is, well, if price inflation is the goal of monetary policy, how can we measure monetary policy? How can we measure inflation? And well, there are different definitions of inflation. One definition, the classical definition of inflation, just refers to the expansion of the money stock. This is the only objective way of defining inflation. Right? We have a clear definition of what, for example, M1 is, cash money in circulation plus demand deposits, and we can look at how much this monetary aggregate increases every year, so we would have an objective rate of price inflation in the sense. But of course, in the modern sense of the word, we mean something else by inflation. we mean some average rate of price increases. And whenever we use a definition of inflation of that kind, well, other questions arise that unfortunately cannot be answered objectively. Right? We have to answer the question, what prices should be considered when we calculate the average? Some prices might be more important than others, and there's no objective way of determining what the relevant prices are. And then, of course, we don't know what type of average we should calculate. There are different averages we could calculate. Geometric averages, harmonic averages, or mixed averages. We could use different weighting schemes and so on. All of these questions are very interesting from a technical standpoint, but theory tells us that we cannot answer them objectively. Why? Because what we are dealing with is fundamentally something subjective. When we calculate an inflation rate, we, in essence, want to answer the question, how much more or less money do we need in order to be able to buy a given degree of want satisfaction, a given degree of utility, or a given standard of living? And all of these notions are subjective. There's no way of objectively determining it. So the bottom line is that there is no objective way of defining price inflation in the modern sense of the word, but it still is the policy goal of monetary policy. And this, of course, then means that there is some wiggle room for monetary policy to distort the definition of price inflation, the calculation of the average, in a way that distorts our analysis of the phenomenon. In the worst case, because there is no objective way of defining price inflation, this could lead to policy abuses. We calculate and publish some inflation rate, everyone takes it for granted, and as long as the official number roughly corresponds to the policy goal, monetary policy is off the hook and can do whatever it wants. So there is a potential danger here that is quite obvious. Let's look at some of the official numbers. So I picked here two countries from the Eurozone, France and Germany, the two countries where I live and work. Those are the main economies of the Eurozone. We have the price inflation rate measured by the harmonized index of consumer prices, which is the standard measure of inflation used for monetary policy in the Eurozone, plotted against the target rate of 2%, and what we can see is that for the longest time the official inflation numbers were roughly around the target. Over the medium run, for a long time, it was slightly below 2%. With the more recent hike during the corona pandemic and the war in Ukraine, we have, over the entire period, pretty much nailed the policy target exactly. The average price inflation rate is at 2% over the entire period. If we look at the United States of America, we have a slightly different but similar picture overall. The volatility is a bit higher. Inflation fluctuates a bit more around the target value of 2%. On average, price inflation has been a bit higher than 2% in the United States over the entire period, which is partly because the Fed also focuses on employment and economic growth as equally important policy goals. So they accept higher inflation rates in the US. Now, all of this is very interesting. Roughly speaking, monetary policy has obtained its goal over the longer period that we are looking at here. But does it mean that everything is good and well in the economy? Well, some data is interesting in this respect, and that's the actual inflation in the classical sense of the word that refers to the expansion of the money stock. Here you can see, plotted as an index, the money stock M1 in the Eurozone since 1998 until fairly recently. So right before we start the time series, right before the introduction of the euro as an accounting currency in '99, and we can see that in the Eurozone the money stock M1 has increased by a factor larger than 6. So in roughly 24 years, M1 has increased by a factor of more than 6. It has increased more than 6-fold. So from initially it was somewhere around 1.6 trillion euros, and at the peak in 2022, it was close to 12 trillion euros. So you get an idea of the magnitude. Yeah? And when you compare this to real economic growth, and this is a statistic that Gunter Schnabel showed you 2 years ago, for those of you who have been there or watched it online. If you compare that to real economic growth, you can see that real economic growth is basically negligent in comparison to the growth of the money stock. Why is this relevant? This is relevant because to the extent that you have real economic growth, money growth can be absorbed without causing inflation. And it's a basic economic idea. If your economy grows in real terms, there are more goods and services sold for money, then unit prices of the goods and services don't have to increase. Price inflation can be absorbed, or money growth can be absorbed by real economic growth. Now, if we do the calculation here, we see that on average, the money stock has increased 6.8 percentage points faster than the real economy every year. The real economic growth over the entire period has been around 30 to 40%, very weak in fact, and the money stock has increased by more than 500% over the entire period. So we would expect, if we had some kind of objective, general measurement of inflation, we would expect the inflation rate to be closer to something like 6.8%, which is the excess money growth above real economic growth. But as we have seen, the official numbers tell us that inflation is at 2%. Now, a similar picture emerges when we look at the US. This is quite interesting as a case because in the US, the definition of M1 was changed in 2020 when the monetary policy reactions to Corona were implemented. And so because of the change in definition, we cannot actually compare what we see here in the data. But if we take the last bit out, something very similar emerges. We compare the growth of the M1 money stock to real economic growth in the US, we see that the money increased significantly faster, the money stock increased significantly faster than GDP. In the US, it's 5.6% on average per year. And something else is striking when you look at this statistic here. In the US, the divide between money growth and real economic growth seems to happen only after the financial crisis of 2008, which is, well, in the aftermath of 2008, unconventional monetary policies were implemented. Be that as it may, we would expect there to be higher price inflation rates in the US as well. And we would expect some general price inflation index to show a larger rate per year on average than the official CPI. Now, of course, there are ways to explain this gap. This gap is not entirely mysterious. There are other ways of explaining the gap than just referring to the weaknesses of the indices used. It could be the case that the demand for money has simply increased in the US and in Europe, and there has been all of this money created, but people basically don't spend it. They hold it on their bank accounts or under the pillow at home. They don't spend it on goods and services, and to the extent that money is not spent on goods and services, it cannot actually push prices up. So that is a possible explanation. But it is not a very good explanation to explain the entire gap away. This is not very persuasive that this could explain this significant gap between real economic growth and money growth over a relatively long period of time. In fact, would we expect that people hold their money for longer than before if price inflation increases? Not really. We would rather expect the opposite. Even if price inflation is moderate at 2%, we would expect there to be an incentive for money users to spend the money faster than holding on to it for longer periods of time. So demand for money could, for other reasons, still explain part of the gap, but certainly not all of it. And then we have the price index, the CPI and HICP, that could simply underestimate price inflation. That's the other explanation. Why can the CPI or HICP underestimate price inflation? Well, there are essentially two reasons. Either it is just structurally downward biased, so the index that we calculate is no good for various different reasons we don't have to go into it. It's downward biased, it structurally underestimates price inflation. The other explanation, which for my talk is more important, is that the index might be a good, the CPI, the HICP might be good indices for measuring inflation, but they measure not where inflation actually happens. There are sectors of the economy that are excluded from the CPI and the HICP, and those are the sectors where overproportionate inflation materializes, where a lot of this excess money growth actually leads to price inflation, but we don't look at it because we don't consider these sectors to be sectors of consumer goods and services. And it's very easy to convince yourself that this is the case. You don't actually have to look up the statistics of the European Commission or Eurostat. You can just look around you. In many European countries, we have overproportionate real estate price inflation. We have overproportionate asset price inflation, stock price inflation, and so on. We find many markets in the economy where there is high inflation that is not at all looked at in the HICP or the CPI. The same is true in the US, same is true in Asian countries. The phenomenon actually is widespread, and we find it basically everywhere. So the bottom line is monetary policy has been engaged in large-scale expansions of the money stock, both in the US and in Europe and in other regions in the world. And the expansion of the money stock is what actually matters when we want to analyze the effects of monetary policy. It is the expansion of the money stock that leads to the important effects in terms of the distribution of income and wealth. It is inflation in the classical sense that we should consider. And in this first part of the talk, I gave you an idea of the extent of the phenomenon. What is the extent of the expansion of the money stock? It's quite significant. And we have to ask, okay, where does all of this excess money go? Who are the players, the businesses, the individuals in the economy who receive that money, who get to spend the money first? And this way we could actually get an idea of who the winners are and who the losers are in this process, and how this all affects the distribution of income and wealth. Now, when we think about the distributive effects of monetary policy, we have to mention one important historical figure in the history of economic ideas, which is the French-Irish economist Richard Cantillon. The distributive effects of monetary policy, the creation of money, are referred to as Cantillon effects. Richard Cantillon was a banker who lived before Adam Smith. So even before classical economics really was a thing, Richard Cantillon wrote about his practical experience as a banker and tried to generalize what he has seen and experienced in his everyday job. And he argued that the creation of money, the production of money, distorts, changes the distribution of income and wealth. It's a very simple, very basic idea. In fact, Cantillon argued that this is not simply a phenomenon that applies to money, but it is a general phenomenon of the economic process. Whenever we produce anything, we actually change the distribution of income and wealth. Right? When you start a business, you produce something and you offer it for sale and you attract consumer demand, you generate income for you, and that is income that others don't receive. So you change the income distribution through your act of production. So it's a general phenomenon that applies everywhere, and it is not fundamentally a problem. It's quite normal that this occurs. But in the case of the production of money, which is in the hands of the government or central banks, we have to think about the implications. And what does it mean when the government does the job? In particular, what does it mean in the fiat money system where money can just be created out of thin air? How does it affect the income distribution? And now, the first idea or the first thing to be pointed out is that inflation, price inflation, is not a homogeneous phenomenon. There are differences in the rate at which various prices in the economy increase. Some prices increase quickly, others increase slowly, some might decrease, some revenues might increase faster than others. So because of this heterogeneity, we have a process that creates winners and losers. It might be a more or less arbitrary process without any structural effects, but it certainly creates winners and losers because some prices increase faster than others or earlier than others. And the simple rule is that if your selling prices, so the prices for those goods and services that you sell increase faster and earlier than your buying prices, the prices for the goods and services that you buy, then you win. And the other way around. If your buying prices increase faster than your selling prices, and if your rent increases faster than your salary, you lose. Yeah? So that's the basic idea, through which we can say that monetary policy, the creation of new money, distorts the distribution of income and wealth. Now, in what direction does it go? In principle, it could go in any direction. Monetary policy could, in principle, diminish inequality. It could make the distribution of income and wealth more equal. It could, in principle, be more or less neutral with some random effects here and there. And it could actually contribute to larger inequalities, which is, of course, the case I want to make in this talk. But it has to be said that, in principle, it could go in any direction. We just have to determine who the players in the economy are, for whom the selling prices increase earlier, who are the players that receive a larger, disproportionate chunk of the new money and get to spend it first. As in this way we can identify the winners and we can draw some conclusions about whether inequality is affected positively or negatively by monetary policy. So, in order to tackle this problem, we have to think about the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And here we make a distinction between conventional monetary policy on the one hand and unconventional monetary policy on the other hand. Conventional monetary policy is all about setting and influencing the interest rate. The central bank sets the central rate of interest at which commercial banks can refinance their operations with the central bank. They can get new liquidity from the central bank. And if the central bank diminishes the central rate of interest, decreases the central rate of interest, market rates of interest, at least in the short term, tend to decrease as well. So conventional monetary policy works through the credit markets. The credit channel is important here. New money enters the economy in the form of credit when we deal with conventional monetary policy. And now if you think about how credit works, you realize, okay, credit is inherently discriminatory. Take the position of a commercial banker who is in the business of granting credit or not. What would you do? Well, you give the credit, if you can, to an individual or a business with a relatively high revenue, or with assets that can be used as collateral, and you do not give the credit to a less fortunate individual or business. And if you have the choice between a person that is well off and a person that is not so well off, you pick the person that is well off. And in any event, the person with high income and wealth gets better conditions in the credit transaction. because that person represents a lower default risk. So that's perfectly reasonable. Credit markets work in this way for good economic reasons. But it means, of course, because credit is inherently discriminatory, that it is at the advantage of people who are relatively well off and at the disadvantage of people who are not so well off. Low interest rates, against conventional wisdom, tend to benefit people who are already well off. It is no surprise that the now re-elected American President Donald Trump once said, "I love low interest rates," because low interest rates tend to benefit people like him, like real estate tycoons. They can get a large chunk of new money through the credit system. They can leverage their operations and get an advantage, receive an advantage over smaller competitors in this way. So it is good for the haves, it is bad for the have-nots, we can say. Unconventional monetary policy is about buying assets directly. The central bank acts not as a lender of last resort, but as a market maker of last resort, in that it buys certain assets directly. Mostly government bonds, but also corporate bonds in many cases. So the central bank basically keeps certain market segments artificially afloat that would actually break down if we did not have unconventional monetary policy. So this pushes or keeps asset prices artificially high. And of course, both of these elements tend to contribute to an increase in inequality. Both work at the advantage of the haves and at the disadvantage, at the expense of the have-nots. Those who are not fortunate, who don't have high revenues, who do not possess wealth. So we can say that monetary policy in this sense aggravates existing income and wealth inequalities. Now, of course, there is a debate, a very lively debate about this whole issue in the economic literature. And one argument that is often made is that monetary policy actually reduces inequality because when we engage in expansionary monetary policy, we keep employment higher than it would otherwise be. Think of an economic crisis, employment would plummet, people would lose their jobs. Now the central bank intervenes, provides new liquidity, the jobs can be saved, can be rescued, people keep their employment, they continue to receive a salary, and because central banks are doing this, they are actually contributing to lower inequality. Because if people would lose their jobs, it would primarily hit people in the lower segment of the income distribution. They would lose their jobs, they would then have even less income, and inequality would be bigger. Now, what can we say about this argument, the employment channel? It's true that this can work, but it works only in the short run. It's a short-run argument. Okay, we save some jobs over the short run. Some people preserve a higher income than they would have in the absence of the intervention. Income for the short term, inequality for the short term might actually be reduced because of that. But if we take a longer term perspective, we find the opposite effect. Inflationary, expansionary monetary policy actually tends to undermine wage developments. If we look at the evolution of real wages, we can see that real wages in many countries, for example, my home country, Germany, have not increased over the past 20 years, even if we take the official inflation numbers. If we look at the median wage and correct for the HICP, we have basically no growth in the real wage. And if we consider asset prices and so on, we actually see that wages decline. So in the long run, this inflationary policy seems to be contributing to a reduction in real wages. Maybe not in every country in the absolute sense, but certainly, relatively speaking, real wages are lower because of inflationary monetary policy. And how can we explain this? Well, we can explain this by reference to the investment behavior of businesses and households. if you have an inflationary environment that generates overproportionate asset price inflation, it becomes very interesting for you as an investor to invest in a speculative manner. You engage in speculative investments where you buy existing assets and you count on the price of these assets increasing, and in this way you can make a profit. As opposed to engaging in productive investments where you buy factors of production and you actually produce new assets, you produce stuff. This is very risky. In an inflationary economy, you can at least count on existing assets to become more and more expensive over time. So you are tempted to invest speculatively and not productively. But if you do not invest productively, then of course the capital stock cannot increase. But an increase in the capital stock is necessary in order to increase labor productivity and to increase real wages. So if productive investments are not happening to the same extent that they used to, wages cannot rise to the same extent. And so we can actually make a quite convincing argument, as I think, that counters this employment channel argument. In the long run, the inflationary expansionary monetary policy actually does the reverse. It reduces wage levels, specifically in the lower segment of the income distribution, and thus tends to increase inequality. Now, I already referred to overproportionate asset price inflation. How can we explain this? How can we explain the fact that inflation in the real estate markets, in the stock markets, and in other asset markets is so high when we compare that to official consumer price inflation? Well, here we can refer not to the investment behavior of firms and individuals, but to the saving behavior more generally. If we have an inflationary economy, even if inflation is only moderate at relatively low rates, 2% let's say, the demand for assets that lose purchasing power, so that applies mostly to deposits and cash, also to savings deposits, in particular when the real interest rate is negative. The demand for those assets goes down, and there is an increase in the demand for assets that protect against inflation. So there is an added increase in the demand for assets like real estate and stocks, precious metals, cryptocurrencies, you name it. And so there is naturally an overproportionate rate of price inflation when it comes to these assets, because the demand increases for these assets not only in accordance with the general increase in the money stock, but overproportionately because there's this shift in the saving behavior of individuals. And we can look at a lot of data here. If you look, for example, at Germany and you take the stock market index, then you can see that since the introduction of the euro, stock prices in Germany have increased significantly faster than consumer prices. The average rate is about 5.5%. Well, you could say, okay, that's great, the German businesses were very productive, but real economic growth wasn't that high in Germany. And you can very easily convince yourself that this is an inflationary phenomenon if you just look at what happened during the first stages of the corona crisis. During the pandemic, when massive amounts of liquidity were created by the central banks, stock prices in Germany actually increased significantly. There was a sharp decrease at the beginning, but then came the monetary policy response and stock prices went through the roof. Overall, they increased by about 8% per year during that period. So this cannot be because of real economic gains, productivity gains, and so on. There were no productivity gains in that period in real terms. It's only because of massive inflationary monetary policy interventions. Let's look at some more data. Real estate prices, housing prices. Here again for the two countries that I picked earlier, France and Germany. since the introduction of the euro, house prices in France have, within a very short period of time, only 9 years, they have more than doubled. Then came the financial crisis. They stagnated for a while, and shortly after the advent of unconventional monetary policies, they started to increase again. In Germany, we did not have house price inflation initially. We had stock price inflation. Prior to the financial crisis, house prices remained stable in Germany, but since the financial crisis, house prices in Germany have roughly doubled on average. And this is for the entire country as an average. If we look at the big cities, it's actually more than a doubling in house prices. And this, of course, is problematic if your wages do not keep up. Again, if you take the perspective of a household that has no assets yet, receives roughly an average income, then it becomes harder to buy a house to live in. Yeah? For regular people, it becomes harder to do what used to be quite normal, in Germany at least, and in France. It has become harder to do that. So in that sense, the situation is worsened for households who do not already own real estate. Here you have the comparison to the consumer price inflation, and you see that real estate price inflation, house price inflation was clearly overproportionate. In France, there's no question about it. In Germany, it was underproportionate for a while, but then it quickly kept up. So we have distributive effects of monetary policy, and they tend to create greater inequalities. And we can be a bit more specific about these inequalities. Who are the groups between which there is redistribution? One group I didn't talk about at all so far is, of course, the distribution from the private to the public sector. Monetary policy, central banking, from its beginning was about financing governments. So clearly there is an element of redistribution towards the government, away from the private sector, and this holds true today. It wasn't only true back in the 17th century when the first central banks were founded. It's true today. And one reason why there is increased redistribution from private to public because of expansionary monetary policy is the phenomenon of bracket creep. There's general price inflation, so all prices increase, some faster, some slower, but all prices increase, and all revenues and incomes increase as well. So people are pushed into higher and higher tax brackets, and a larger chunk of their income is taxed away to the government. So inflation actually helps finance the government in this way. There is redistribution in other ways. There is redistribution from the relatively poor to the relatively well-off or relatively rich because of asset price inflation. Asset price inflation is not per se a bad thing if you own the assets already. Okay, if you own the assets already, you enjoy asset price inflation. If house prices increase and you are a house owner, that's great for you. But if you are not, that's a problem. Okay, the distance between you, who is poor, and the other person who is rich increases because of asset price inflation. There is also redistribution from labor income to capital income and capital gains. Okay, because of this shift in investment behavior, there's more speculative investment going on, less productive investment, so wages do not tend to increase as fast. But you can still make gains on the capital markets because of inflation. You can make capital gains. And this is problematic, well, for the average person, right? The average person in any society is dependent on labor income. And if labor income suffers, if there's redistribution away from labor income and towards capital income, then the relatively rich tend to benefit. And then lastly, there's redistribution intergenerationally between young and older people. So there is redistribution away from the young towards the older generations. And not least because younger people are often more dependent on labor income because they did not have time yet to build up wealth. So they often do not own wealth unless they inherit from their parents or grandparents. So they are more dependent on labor income. If labor income does not increase as quickly, younger generations tend to suffer. This overproportionate asset price inflation tends to undermine social mobility. And for this, I want to show you another statistic. What you can see here in the graph is the net wealth to income ratio in France and Germany. So the statistic shows the overall monetary value of all the assets in the country that exist at a given moment divided by the annual income of the population. Okay, so if the wealth to income ratio is at 4, it means that all of the wealth, all of the assets combined, measured in money, are worth 4 times the annual income of the population. Okay, and this is a standard indicator for social mobility. We can roughly say that the higher the wealth to income ratio is, the harder it is to climb up the wealth distribution if you start from a modest background. If you are wealthy already, of course, you don't have a problem. Yeah? But if you start from a modest background, if you are dependent on your labor income, and you start to work your way up the wealth distribution of society, it is harder to achieve, to reach any given position in the wealth distribution if the wealth to income ratio is really high, which means that wealth assets are really expensive compared to the income that you can make. Yeah? And of course here in this statistic you can see the striking development in France after the introduction of the euro. If you plot, if you add to the plot the house prices that we've seen before, we see a very close correlation. The net wealth to net income ratio in France since the introduction of the euro has increased significantly in accordance with house price inflation and in fact other assets that were inflated during that period. And in Germany we can see that the whole phenomenon started a bit later when house prices increased after the financial crisis. So what are the implications here? I want to give you a very simplistic calculation to illustrate the point. If you go back to France in the 1990s, when the wealth to income ratio was at 3.5, so overall wealth was 3.5 times as big as annual income. If you are in that situation and you, as an individual, start without any wealth, you start to work, you receive an average income, and you save 10% of your income every year, how long would it take for you to reach the average wealth position in society? Well, if the wealth to income ratio is at 3.5, you would need 35 years to do so. So within a working life, that's possible to do. If the wealth to income ratio is, however, closer to 7, as is recently the case, you would need not 35 years, but 70 years under the same condition just to reach the average level of wealth. So social ascent, climbing up the social ladder, the wealth distribution, has become significantly more difficult in France. The same is true in Germany. And if we look at the United States, because we had some data from the United States as well, here it is, we see the same overall pattern. The wealth-to-income ratio has increased, but not as significantly as in Europe and in many other European countries. You could look at Spain, for example. Spain had a significant increase in the wealth-to-income ratio. The difference to the US, despite the fact that income inequality is higher in the US when we compare that to Europe, the difference is that incomes in the US are allowed to increase to much higher levels than in Europe, because in Europe we have much higher taxation. High incomes are basically taxed away in Europe. In the US that's not the case. And so in the US, incomes are allowed to be higher, so the wealth-to-income ratio tends to be a bit lower. And on average, at least, social mobility is still looking better in the US than in Europe. All right. Now let us, in the last part, talk a little bit about further implications of these developments. So that inequality increases is not something that only happens in the minds of some classical liberals or libertarians. A lot of people are talking about it. It's a very hot topic, rising inequality. Also, not only in the public discourse, but also in the academic literature, it's discussed. So there is a widespread sense, one could say, of injustice that spreads in society in light of rising inequality. Some or many people feel that there is something fundamentally unjust about it. And of course, if you think about it, if the causal mechanism that I tried to lay out in my talk today is true, if there's something to it, then we could argue that it is unjust because it's politics contributing to it. Monetary policy is actually contributing to inequality. It is not inequality that emerges naturally out of productive decision-making, out of entrepreneurship, out of voluntary choices by individuals. It's inequality that emerges out of political decisions, and this might well be considered unjust. So that there is this sense of injustice is not entirely unjustified. We hear more and more talk about existential fears and despair. The British-American Nobel laureate Angus Deaton famously talked about deaths of despair. He didn't relate that to monetary policy and inflation. He did relate that to other things, and I would not deny that other causes are important here. But of course, existential fears and despair can actually be increased if asset price inflation is overproportionate and regular people feel that they cannot make it, they cannot keep up with others, with high performers in the upper parts of the income distribution. Because of that, we can see more and more resentment towards the institutions in our economies and our societies, towards politics, towards elites, and towards the economic system in general. People tend to think that the system is rigged against them, and that's not entirely false. And they resent the system. They tend to be against it. We can see this in decreasing voter participation in elections. For quite a long time we have decreasing voter participation. We can also see this in survey data, where people say that they do not trust political institutions, they do not trust politicians, they do not trust political parties, and they do not think that politicians are actually capable of solving our problems. So people are fed up with the system. They vote less, and if they vote on the political extremes, which is also quite natural, right? If you have the feeling that the established center parties do not solve the problems that you clearly can observe around you, you vote on the left and the right. And I'm afraid on both sides, the left and the right, we have dangerous tendencies of collectivism. If you come from a perspective of classical liberalism, this is actually something that is quite frightening. We can also observe, and this is more of a cultural point, I don't have very hard data on this, although some data exists. We can see more nihilistic and hedonistic lifestyle choices, specifically among younger generations. Yeah? And I would argue that this can also be explained by monetary policy and by inflation, by overproportionate asset price inflation, at least to some extent. Because if it is really true that upward social mobility is undermined, asset prices are skyrocketing and your incomes do not catch up, it is harder for you to build up wealth for the future. It is actually harder for you to prepare for the future, and then you might well decide not even to try it. If it is so hard, why not just enjoy what you have in the moment, yeah, live in the moment, consume what you have, at least have a good time, and don't care about tomorrow. Yeah? In French we would say après nous le déluge, after us the flood. This seems to be much more widespread sentiment among many groups in society. I'm not saying that it is the case everywhere, but there's a tendency towards more of these hedonistic lifestyle choices. And now the most important, I think, consequence for us is, of course, the cause and effect analysis. In this discussion, where all of these phenomena are mixed in some way, and the resentment comes in, and despair comes in, existential fears come in, a lot of people blame markets, entrepreneurship, the capitalist economic system for the effects of monetary policy interventionism. And I think in this discussion we have to emphasize the fact that at least partly the problems that we see around us are not naturally grown out of a competitive market system, but they come from political interventionism. And if we want to counter these developments, if we want to reduce inequality, we would have to start at the causes first. We shouldn't try to diminish the effects. We should start to get rid of the causes. And if monetary policy, if inflationary, expansionary monetary policy is one cause of increasing inequality, then we should first reform monetary policy before we start to reform the entire economic system and shift towards more government control in all areas of economic life. That would be my main conclusion, and with that I would like to open it up for discussions.
Thank you very much for your interesting your presentation. Now it's time for discussion. Nech sa páči, kto máte záujem, môžete sa prihlásiť. Mikrofón poputuje k vám v rukách nášho asistenta. Využite tú príležitosť. Môžete sa aj predstaviť, to je dobrovoľné, ale teda povedzte, a to je povinné, v akom jazyku sa chcete spýtať, aby sa mohol pán profesor pripraviť, či v slovenčine alebo v angličtine. A využite prosím svoj čas, 2 minúty, aby bolo čo najväčší priestor pre čo najviac z vás na otázky alebo konkrétne námety. Takže kto má záujem, nech sa páči. Tu v druhom rade.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Jan Rody. My name is Jan Rody. And my question is, Mr. Professor, if we talk about inflation and the consequences of inflation, how about deflation? We have also some cases, for example, in Japan, there is deflation. And in some cases, I think it makes even bigger problems than inflation.
Yes, so deflation has indeed a very bad reputation, not only in economics as a scientific discipline, but also in general discussion, but some research, or actually all of the research that tries to estimate what the consequences of deflation are on the economic system, find that there is no structural connection, no necessary connection between price deflation and bad economic performance. There are some outliers. The main outlier in economic history is the Great Depression, where we had massive price deflation and low economic growth or shrinking economies. But if we look at the long-term picture, we find many cases all over the world where there are prolonged periods of time with price deflation and very good real economic performance, high economic growth. And the explanation is very simple. Price deflation does not usually happen unless you have economic growth. Most of price deflation is benign growth deflation. It happens because the economy is growing in real terms. There are more goods and services produced and sold, hence prices diminish. We can see this even today in our inflationary economies in certain sectors where there is a lot of technological progress. Take the IT sector, computers, mobile phones, etc. Lots of innovations going on, lots of technological progress, and prices in these sectors decrease over time in spite of very inflationary monetary policy. Why? Because economic growth is happening. The other reason why deflation happens is fractional reserve banking and banking crises. When you have fractional reserve banking, commercial banks expanding or issuing new demand deposits that are not actually backed by bank reserves, and then these banks go bankrupt, the overall money stock shrinks because the unbacked demand deposits that were created are basically just are lost. The money is gone away, and the overall money stock decreases because of that. Because of prior inflation, due to fractional reserve banking, the overall money stock then decreases, and then we have a bank deflation, or a bank credit deflation, as it is sometimes called. That's a bad type of deflation. But we only have it because of prior monetary policy interventions. It's not something that happens naturally out of the market economy. Yeah? So I would be very careful about deflation. Deflation is not a problem per se. It depends on the type of deflation, and the type of deflation that is dangerous comes about because of monetary policy interventions again. And the more widespread good type of deflation is growth deflation, and we would all love that. This is a great type of deflation because this is how wealth and an increased standard of living spreads through society. Because prices for goods and services decrease, things get cheaper and cheaper.
Thanks. The ďalší vzadu, nech sa páči.
Spýtam sa v slovenčine, lebo nie som prezident Zelenský, aby som si mohol dovoliť hovoriť zlou angličtinou. No, takže...
Počkajte chvíľu.
Áno.
Let's try it.
Čiže môžem, v podstate teraz prebieha teda na Ukrajine vojna, kde vlastne aj Európa, aj Amerika poskytuje...
Počkajte chvíľu, počkajte. Ešte raz.
Dobre, tak
Yes.
na Ukrajine beží vojna, kde Spojené štáty americké aj Európska únia poskytuje jednak veľkú vojenskú pomoc, ktorá je v podstate financovaná tým, že sa točia rotačky, teda akože aj v Amerike, aj vo Frankfurte. A v podstate už teraz začínajú sa dávať Ukrajine teda pôžičky, ktoré každému musí byť jasné, že tá krajina to nebude môcť vrátiť. A zase je to vlastne to, že sa tlačia peniaze na to. Takže chcem sa spýtať, že pán profesor, ako si myslí, že teda, že skončí tento prípad, by som to povedal, že teda, že aký to bude mať vplyv teda na tú dobu, keď teda tá vojna skončí. Hej? Lebo keď vojna skončí, tak sa bude rechnovať, ako, hej? Teda spočítavať, ako, hej? A účtovať. Takže ďakujem.
Thank you very much for this question. This is very difficult, but also very interesting case, obviously. I think it's true that the financial assistance to the Ukraine is largely provided out of the printing press, so out of expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy makes things like this possible. This has been true throughout all of economic history. Central banks were first founded in order to finance wars, and there's a consistency in the history. Yeah? The Federal Reserve, for example, arguably the most important central bank in the world, was founded in 1913, right before the First World War. Of course, the Americans did not start the war, but they entered the war, and this was made easier by the Federal Reserve. And today, the war in Ukraine is financed largely, again, out of the printing press. The financial assistance to the Ukraine is provided out of inflationary monetary policy, partly at least. And I think it's correct to assume, or it's very likely, that the credit that the financial support that Ukraine receives today won't be paid back. But it doesn't really matter, because you can just print the money and you just delete the debt in the end when the settlement is due, or you give further financial support to the Ukraine and you tie that to certain economic conditions, and you can make basically Ukraine a vassal state of NATO. All of this fits, I would say, very well into the general analysis of the redistributive effects of expansionary monetary policy. Here again, there's redistribution going on. It's quite obvious that what happens in the Ukraine is at the detriment of the Ukrainian people, at the expense of the Ukrainian people, and also at the expense of Russians. Who benefits? Well, there's financial support to the Ukrainian government, yes, but the Ukrainian government is basically paying the military industry. So the industrial military complex is basically the big beneficiary of this. There's redistribution going on from the general public through the military industrial complex with the help of expansionary monetary policy. So that's my take on this, and that's all I want to say about this very hot and disputed topic.
Thank you very much. Here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will ask in English. Do you think that some kind of standard, like it was gold standard or other standard with a limited money supply, is feasible, realistically feasible? And the second question is, if you think that this matter of the state of matters, that having such standard is a natural, that just the governments and I don't know, other powers are trying to push us away from that. But the natural state of affairs is some standard of the limited money supply. Thank you.
Yeah, so in principle, in theory, it is feasible to have some monetary standard that restricts significantly the expansion of the money stock. But I don't see the political will to actually implement such a system. It's feasible in principle, but realistically, likely, it is not, I think. Because from the vantage point of those who can actually push towards such reforms, it's not actually beneficial to do so because it's so convenient to have a printing press by which you can finance all kinds of things, not only wars, but all kinds of other political adventures and political programs. Take the Green Deal in Germany, it's big at the moment with our current government. This is possible because you can partly finance these programs out of the printing press and you can go into debt. So from the vantage point of politics, I don't see any willingness to implement such a system. But it could work in principle, and I would argue if we did it, it would work better. There would be a hard transition period, I guess, because a lot of businesses, a lot of the structures that grew over the past couple of decades in our economies are dependent on cheap credit, and if we get rid of the system, they would have to be liquidated. So there would be an adjustment crisis, certainly. But in the medium to long term, this would actually be a good thing if we restricted the expansion of the money stock to something that is closer to, let's say, 4 to 5% per year on average, not 8% as we had in the Eurozone. And I would be in favor of even a lower rate of increase of the money stock. Something that would be in the range of 2 to 3% would actually be fine, roughly comparable to real economic growth. And in the long term, this wouldn't be harmful for the economy. It would just restrict and limit politics a lot, and that's why it's probably not done.
In general, or from pragmatic point of view, what are your key proposals? How to stop this tendency? How to change the system, monetary system? What about currency competition? What about prohibit central banks buying government bonds? What do you think? What is possible? What is desirable? What is your position?
So within the system that we have right now, it would be perfectly possible to restrict the expansion of the money stock M1 to whatever rate is wanted. So 4%, 5%. We could do that, no problem. We could actually freeze the money stock. This wouldn't happen, it's very unlikely, but within the current system, we don't have to change anything else, we just restrict the extent of monetary expansion to lower rates. Yeah, so on average in the Eurozone we had about 8% per year increase in the money stock M1, that's restricted to 4. We halve it. So that would already be an improvement within the existing system. We wouldn't have to change anything else. But then of course I would go further than that, and I would be in favor of monetary competition. I think we should not over-regulate private initiatives like cryptocurrencies that can be promising in providing competing means of payments and means of exchange. We should allow people to use other monies, other currencies if they so desire. But I would expect that if we did the first step, if we just restricted the expansion of the money stock and if we had a much less inflationary money issued by the government, people would be perfectly happy with it and use it and wouldn't even look for alternatives. The demand for cryptocurrencies would actually go down quite significantly if the official fiat money wasn't that inflationary. The main reason why people are looking for alternatives is because the official money is so bad. And people notice this. This is why they are looking for alternatives. And if we just make the official money slightly better, the demand for alternatives would go down and people would probably just continue using the official money.
Nech sa páči, v 4. rade. Tak potom.
Ja skúsim v slovenčine, tak počkám chvíľku. Ja mám v podstate dve také otázky. Tu jednu už ste trošku naznačili teraz v tej predchádzajúcej časti, čo sa týka vlastne nejaké alternatívy smerom na kryptoaktíva alebo kryptomeny. Vidíte toto ako nejakú reálnu alternatívu k vlastne tým fiatovým súčasným štandardným menám v zmysle nejakého teoretického prístupu? A to ako jeden ten pohľad, teda z hľadiska ekonomických teórií a druhý ten pohľad z hľadiska tej realizovateľnosti v súčasných politických situáciách. Teraz primárne narážam na to, že je to v podstate nejaké v úvodzovkách digitálne virtuálne zlato, hej, čiže niečo, čo je použiteľné v súčasných podmienkach a súčasne nie je kontrolované ako centrálnou autoritou a využívané inak ako trhovo v podstate. Že tam ten trh relatívne dobre pôsobí, takže to je prvá časť otázky, alebo tá prvá otázka a druhá otázka, ak môžem ešte projekt euro versus štandardné meny typu, ja neviem, britská libra, alebo teda tie, čo samozrejme americký dolár, niektoré ďalšie meny. Vnímate nejaký rozdiel z hľadiska nejakých rizik, o ktorých ste prednášali? Teda je to euro lepšie dá sa lepšie manipulovať zo strany politikov, alebo opačne, že je skôr stabilnejšie a menej podlieha tým politickým vplyvom?
Yeah, let me start with the second question. It's easier, it's in my memory. So, let's talk about the euro. Is the euro better or worse than other standard currencies like the British pound, the US dollar? I would say that there is no fundamental difference. What is interesting in the case of the euro, and some economists in Europe have made this argument, is that at least for some countries in Europe, in the eurozone, the euro is better than what they would have instead if they had their own currency. So, for example, Jesus Huerta de Soto in Madrid, in Spain, argued very famously that he is a fan of the euro because it's better than the Spanish currency, the peso, they had before. It's less inflationary, so it's an improvement for the Spanish economy and for the Spanish people from his perspective. And there might be some other countries, let's say Italy maybe, or Greece, although this argument is hard to make because the Greek economy was one of the economies that really suffered in the advent of the financial crisis and then the European debt crisis afterwards. So I don't think that in the international comparison there is a fundamental difference between the euro and other currencies. But certainly within Europe we can partially make the argument that the euro contributed to a better situation, at least for some countries. Now back to cryptocurrencies and the question of whether this is a viable alternative to the monies we have today. I'm not an expert on the technological side of cryptocurrencies. I don't understand it very well. I trust on what other people say about it, and for the moment, I believe cryptocurrencies are not anywhere close of being monies in the standard sense of the word. Cryptocurrencies today seem to be more like digital speculative assets. You buy them, you hold them, and you might sell them when the price has increased, or you sell them when the price has decreased and you are afraid that it decreases further. But you don't really hold it as a medium of exchange. You don't really use it as a medium of exchange to buy stuff. And as far as I know, when it comes to Bitcoin, for example, the most famous cryptocurrency, it wouldn't actually be technically feasible to do it because the number of transactions that would have to be that would be implemented if the Bitcoin would be used as a medium of exchange are too large. The system cannot actually do it. There are some ideas of how to circumvent this problem. The Lightning system is one of them. So yes, I guess there are solutions, there are technological solutions, but for the moment I don't see it. For the moment, I would say cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are speculative assets. They are not monies, they are not media of exchange. They serve one interesting, very important purpose when it comes to transferring capital across borders and across jurisdictions, because there's no control. Basically, you can transfer capital across borders to other countries, and this is quite a useful service, but it's not really something that, or it's not really, that doesn't make it money. Yeah, let's say it this way. So for the moment, I don't think it's, the cryptocurrencies are quite there, but well, we will see what the future brings, and I don't think it's entirely impossible or even unlikely that cryptocurrencies will rise to the point where they could actually be a serious competitor for government-issued fiat monies.
Nech sa páči, čo tam rade?
Tomáš Krištofori, I'll ask my question in English. Karl, I know that you are also a historian of economics, and my question also will be, because I'm also a historian of economics, and you are inspired by the Austrian school, and here we are very close to Vienna. And I read your paper, or at least some part of your paper on Wieser versus Menger, who were Austrian economists 100 years ago. And Wieser actually taught for 19 years in Prague, and he had several students there. This is not very well known, this is not written at all actually. Perhaps I should write that. But you should. So you actually quote in your 22 paper in European Journal for the History of Economic Thought, one of his Czech students called Willibald Milčuk. I'm not sure whether you are aware that he was a Czech actually. One of the other people who also contributed to the 1926 handbook of the economic sciences, like Wieser was there and Milčuk was also there, so he was a Czech. And my question is that actually there were more of Wieser students, and perhaps I'm not really sure whether this was the case, but to some extent interwar Czechoslovakia, the democratic Czechoslovakia, its monetary policy was perhaps, I'm not 100% sure that this was the case, but it was perhaps inspired to some extent by Wieser. And my question to you is not really about Czechoslovakia, because I guess you don't know too much about it, but let's put it this way. So what would be the economic consequences of Wieser's theories applied to interwar country, like in the 20s or the 30s, let's say? So what would be the effects, and if it would be like better effects or worse effects than if Menger's theory was applied, something like that, if that's not too complicated?
I mean, that's a very interesting and very difficult question. I don't think that the differences between Menger and Wieser in terms of their policy conclusions are very significant. The theoretical basis is different in the two authors. Wieser, in a way, is closer to what developed elsewhere in the Anglo-Saxon literature. Menger is closer to what then later was developed by other students of his, Mises, and to some extent Hayek. Hayek is somewhere in between, I would say. But the policy conclusions they drew are not that different, and I don't think it would make a big difference when you apply any of the two theories, Wieser's or Menger's theory, to an interwar country. They would, both of them would have contributed to lower inflation rates, to less expansion of the money stock, and would thus have helped to bring the economies back on a sustainable long-term growth path. So I don't see a fundamental difference there, really. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, but short follow-up. So basically, perhaps you are saying that the Czechoslovak monetary policy was better because it was to some extent inspired by semi-Austrian economies or central bankers. We, for example, didn't have a hyperinflation like Austria had and Germany had. And I think Mises also wrote a paper about our monetary policy, and he was quite fond of it, I think. So, yeah. Thank you very much for praising Czechoslovakia.
You're welcome. It's a great country.
Nech sa páči. Tomáš, čo doma je?
Well, thank you, Mr. Professor. I'm aware that predicting the future is somewhat a risky business. Anyway, can we predict something, or what can we expect from the new upcoming US administration, considering their monetary policies? What will the monetary policy of the US administration will be like? Shall America be better off? Shall we be better off? Or
okay, and I mean, indeed, it is very difficult to predict the future, in particular when your prediction relies on political decision making or any individual decision making. You can fairly well predict things whenever any one individual decision does not have a significant impact on the outcome. So if you have a big group of people that interact in some way and everybody influences the system in a marginal way, in a slightly way, then you can have some kind of what Hayek would call pattern prediction. You can make certain predictions about what patterns emerge in this system. But when you look at a political process where certain individuals are very powerful and their decisions influence the entire system in certain ways, then it's very difficult to make predictions. And I'm not willing to actually make them or to be on the record of predicting how the future monetary system will look like, because I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. Some people might make predictions that turn out to be true, but they just got lucky. So I hope, and with my work I try to contribute to less inflationary monetary policies in the future, but whether my arguments or the arguments of some of my colleagues will prevail and will convince people, I don't know. And I'm afraid that there are a lot of false, in my opinion, false counter-arguments that tend to convince a lot of people and that are very tempting, especially for people who indirectly or directly benefit from inflationary monetary policy. And that's one of the fundamental problems of the entire system. The people who could change it, who could reform the system, tend to be the people who benefit from the system. Not always in a direct manner, but often in an indirect manner. So they don't have an interest, an incentive to change the system, and so it's a type of dilemma, I would say. So I'm not super optimistic what the immediate future brings. In the longer term, I'm optimistic because the negative consequences of the type of policy that we have implemented over the past decades become more and more visible, and the costs of that become more and more visible, and as more and more people feel the costs directly in their own purse, on their own bank account, there might in the long run be the potential to change the system in a better way. But for the short run, I'm not so optimistic. I think there's a conflict of interest, and so this stands in the way of healthy reforms.
Feedback is very important. We are v druhom rade, nech sa páči.
I would like to get back to the main topic of your presentation, the wealth inequalities. You showed us the thought experiment how monetary policy creates wealth inequalities. But of course, wealth inequalities could be caused by natural, or in a natural way. In a market economy, people do different or make different decisions. There are more skillful, less skillful people, and so on. So also wealth inequalities could be caused by unnatural, I would say. Can you give us your opinion on weights? That what is the weight of the natural causes and these causes based on monetary policies?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you very much. You are of course right. Inequalities are quite natural. They exist naturally in an economy, and in social interactions there are inequalities. And they are not necessarily a problem. Right? From the vantage point of classical liberalism, as long as the inequalities are the outgrowth of a voluntary process in which people interact with one another, where's the harm? You might still be in favor of more equality and redistribution, okay, that's another problem, but certainly everybody would agree that when we have interventions into the system, political interventions into the system, and these interventions themselves create more inequality than there would be in the first place, then this is problematic. Yeah, it should give us pause, and we should rethink the interventions, because we certainly don't want to create more inequalities than there are naturally. Now, what are the weights? What is the degree of natural inequality as opposed to artificial inequality that is created through interventions? If we take the example of France, I would say that the rise in wealth inequality and the undermining of social mobility because of the increase in the net worth to net income ratio after the introduction of the euro is almost entirely artificial. It's almost entirely artificial. It is driven by expansionary monetary policies of the ECB, and also because of capital flows. We have to add that capital flows from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. Because the Eurozone was founded, a lot of savers in Northern Europe, Germany, Netherlands, and so on, would buy assets in Southern European countries, including France. So that's pushed up asset prices. We could say that this is partly natural, but the main driver of it is monetary policy reform. It's the creation of the Eurozone, it's the creation of the common currency, and it is all stimulated by the expansion of the money stock that immediately kicked in after the creation of the European Central Bank and the Euro system. So I would say that in this specific case, the increases in inequality and the undermining of social mobility that we've seen in the data that I showed is almost entirely driven by inflation and expansionary monetary policy. Now, this is not to say that in the absence of any inflationary monetary policy, that we wouldn't have wealth inequality and that we wouldn't have a certain wealth to income ratio. Where would it be? It's hard to say. Probably closer to 3, 4, not to 7. 7 or 8, this seem to be very unnatural wealth-to-income ratios for any societies. Even if we go back to the 19th century, we don't see wealth-to-income ratios that high, usually. They tend to be a bit higher in the 19th century, but in democratic, modern economies, we don't see that unless we have massive monetary policy inflation.
Thank you very much. Kto další má záujem, môžete využiť. No, last question, Ivar.
We've been touching upon the basic currencies and central banks, but you did not mention the southern part of the world. I mean, BRICS and China, Russia and Brazil. And in your opinion, their prospects are better or worse than the prospects of traditional currencies in terms of distribution of wealth and inequalities? Thank you.
It's very difficult to answer. I have to give you a guesstimate. My knowledge about these countries is not sufficiently good to make a really give a really informed answer to this question. But my gut feeling is that the situation in these countries is not actually better. And there's a lot of talk about the danger of China rising and the new Cold War II is a big topic among neoconservatives in the US. And certainly China is a very strong economy, but they have huge problems, not least because of the demographic problems they face. So this is going to be very hard for them to cope with. Also, a lot of the investments that were made in China were at least partly planned or controlled by the government through various channels, regulation of the financial system, direct control of the financial system. And I wonder how sustainable the high growth rates were that we observed in China over the past couple of decades. They are decreasing already, and this is also natural as economies grow and catch up with other economies. Growth rates tend to decrease, and I don't think that China will just overtake the rest of the world just like that. I think the downward trend in the growth rates will continue, and China will start to stagnate sooner or later. India might be different, but I'm even less familiar with the situation in India. I don't know. I don't really know. But also there, I would guess that the situation is not really better. But that's just a guess.
Okay. Well, once more, last question. Here you are, because time is.
Thank you. Hi, Martin. I have a question for you, Professor. I need your personal advice how to have a good life in this type of system, because you said like cryptocurrency will not replace the fiat, for example, in 30 years. I mean, okay, Bretton system is out of the question. Politicians don't let us to have a golden standard. Also the banks, I don't know, the fiat will be less and less worth it, and for the people outside of this room, like ordinary people, what we should do to have a better life in this system or in this world?
This is a great question to end the session. So it's very fitting. If you only had someone who feels inclined to give advice on these matters. I'm very hesitant But I mean, the general rules of investment and saving and provision for the future apply here as well. Diversify your portfolio. Save in real assets, not in phony, baloney monetary assets. Invest and save also in the form of social capital, social relationships, friendships, family, and so on. This is going to be very important, especially if the situation continues to worsen. And I'm afraid in many economies, in many sectors, for a large strata of the population, the situation is actually worsening. And if that continues, social relationships will be very important. And this is hard to do, especially for young people, given the new technologies, social media. We have the feeling that we are all connected to everyone, but really when you look at what young people tend to do is they seem to be more isolated than ever, and they don't really have actual social relationships anymore. They have online digital relationships, but do they really help? If things get worse, I'm not so sure. So my advice would be, in terms of the investment strategy, do not only invest in economic and monetary assets, do also invest in social assets. This is going to be important, I believe.
Thank you very much. We should finish, and therefore I would like once more express our thanks to our partners, to you for participation, and mainly to you, Mr. Professor, for your interesting lecture and your answers during discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.